a billionaire got down on his knees in a hospital basement. Above him stood a woman in a hairnet. 71. Cracked hands. A name he had spent 26 years and more than $1 billion trying to forget. He owed her everything. He had never once asked who she was. 2 years earlier, across town, that same woman had fallen. One hip, one bad winter. Ruth Calloway called her 3 grown children, one at a time, and asked if she could come stay. One at a time, they said no. Then a grocery bag tore open on her front steps, and 5 potatoes rolled down to the sidewalk. Ruth sat there on the cold concrete, one good hand in her lap, and watched them go, with no one in the world coming to pick them up. Then a 15-year-old boy she had never spoken to crossed the street. He said, "Yes, ma'am." He came back the next morning, and the one after that. For 2 years. Under Ruth's bed sat a rusted green box she guarded harder than her own birth certificate. What was inside it, and who she gave it to, would bring that billionaire to his knees. And it would tear her own family in two. Ruth May Calloway was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, in the spring of 1954, the granddaughter of a woman who had cooked for other people's families her whole life and fed her own out of whatever was left. The kitchen Ruth learned in had a wood stove and a screen door that never quite latched, and a green metal recipe box on the windowsill. And her grandmother stood her on a Coca-Cola crate at that stove when she was 6 and taught her the only theology Ruth ever really kept. You feed people. You feed the ones who can pay and the ones who can't. And you don't make a face about which is which, because hungry is hungry, and the Lord didn't ask your bank account at the door. Her grandmother said it different ways on different days, but it always came down to the same thing. And by the time Ruth was grown, it had worn itself into one sentence she carried like a key in her pocket. Nobody eats alone on my watch. Her father came north in 1961, the way half of Tuscaloosa came north in those years, on a train with a cardboard suitcase and an address for a cousin in Cleveland and a promise of work at the steel mill on the flats. He sent for the family the next spring. Ruth was 8 years old, the first time she saw the Cuyahoga River on fire. Which it did back then, a river so full of oil it caught flame, and she remembered thinking the whole North was a strange and burning place. They settled on the east side in a neighborhood of brick doubles and front porches and black families fresh up from Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, all of them learning a colder city together. The block looked out for itself because nobody else was going to. If a child was hungry, somebody's mama fed him. If a man lost his shift at the mill, a casserole showed up without a knock. That was the water Ruth grew up in, and she never once thought it was remarkable, which is exactly why it was. She married Clarence Calloway at 22 in the basement fellowship hall of Greater New Hope Missionary Baptist Church, with red punch and a cake her aunts made, and she stayed a member of that church for the next 49 years. Clarence drove a city bus for the transit authority, the same route most of his life, and the regulars on the number 14 knew him by name and knew he'd wait the extra 10 seconds for the old woman hurrying up the block with her cart. His heart quit at the wheel on a Tuesday afternoon 12 years before this story starts, 2 blocks from the house, and the bus rolled gentle to a stop against the curb, because even dying he set the brake. Ruth kept his transit pass in her wallet from that day on. She never took it out, and she never explained it, and nobody who knew her ever asked her to. They raised 3 children on a bus driver's wages and a cafeteria cook's wages. Which is to say they raised 3 children on arithmetic. And the cafeteria was Mercy Children's Hospital, where Ruth Calloway cooked the night shift for 38 years, and where, in all that time, the daytime people never quite understood what she did down there in the dark. Her kitchen sat 2 floors below the lobby, under fluorescent tubes that hummed and flickered and never got fixed. She started at 10 at night and clocked out at 6 in the morning, and she rode the service elevator up at the end of every shift, smelling of steam and bleach and the particular sweetness of industrial cornbread, her gray hair pinned under a net, her knuckles cracked from 40 years of hot water. She made $9.10 an hour the year she started. She made $16.85 an hour the year she retired. In between, She put 3 children through the public schools and one of them through 2 years of community college. And she did it on the difference, and the difference was not large. Here is the thing about the night shift at a children's hospital that nobody puts in the brochure. The cafeteria closes at 9. After that, the only souls awake on the upper floors are the nurses, the machines, and the parents. The mothers and fathers folded into vinyl chairs outside rooms where their kids were too sick to come home. By 2 in the morning they were hollow and shaking, running on vending machine coffee and fear, and the gift shop downstairs sold a granola bar for $3.40. Ruth saw them every night when she came up to swap the coffee urns. She saw all kinds. She saw a white farmer from down in Holmes County who'd never sat next to a black woman in his life and didn't know how until grief made strangers of everybody and then made family of them. She saw a young mother from Guatemala who spoke almost no English and held a rosary so hard the beads left marks in her palm. She saw a Somali father who prayed on a hospital towel in the corner of the waiting room 5 times a day and would not eat the cafeteria meat because of how it was killed. And Ruth learned, without being asked, to set aside a plate of rice and beans and vegetables for him, covered, on the table by the doors. She did not know the word for what she was doing. She just knew the man was hungry and far from home and that her grandmother would have skinned her for walking past him. So she fed them, a tray here, a foil-wrapped plate there, the kind of food the kitchen logged as waste at the end of the night anyway. Meatloaf that hadn't sold, a roll, green beans, a carton of milk, cornbread when she'd made it, because she made it most nights whether the menu called for it or not. She'd set it down on the little table by the ICU doors without a word, the way you leave food out for something wild that won't take it from your hand, and she'd be gone before they could thank her. She never put in for it. The hospital had no line for feeding the parents, so Ruth moved a few dollars around inside her own paycheck until it came out even. It always came out even. She was good with a budget, the way some people are good with their hands. This is not a small problem, by the way. And it is not a soft one. Researchers who study families with a hospitalized child have found that roughly half of them go through stretches of food insecurity while their kid is on the ward, parents skipping meals so the money stretches, choosing between the parking garage and dinner. 1 in 4 recently hospitalized children comes from a home that can't reliably keep food on the table. Ruth never read a single one of those studies. She just counted the empty chairs at 2 in the morning and did her arithmetic and cooked. She kept track of them in a box, a dented green metal recipe box, the kind that used to sit on every grandmother's counter, the corners gone to rust. The lid held shut with a rubber band because the hinge had given out sometime during the first Bush administration. It was the same box from the windowsill in Tuscaloosa. Her grandmother had pressed it into her hands the week before she died, and behind the index cards for cornbread and red gravy, and a pound cake that called for 9 eggs, Ruth kept the notes, the ones the parents left. Folded squares of paper tucked under the wiper of her old Buick slid into the kitchen door, mailed years later inside Christmas cards. You fed me the night my son coded and I have never forgotten it. She kept everyone. She didn't think of them as proof of anything. She just couldn't make herself throw them away. At Greater New Hope, they called her Mother Calloway, the way the old church calls its faithful women, the ones who have been there longest and carried the most. She sat on the 3rd pew from the front on the left, the mother's pew, in a hat on the high holy days, and she sang alto in a voice that had gone rough but still knew exactly where it was going. She cooked for every repast and every revival. When a young mother in the congregation lost a baby, it was Mother Calloway who showed up at the house with a pot of greens and sat with her in the dark and said almost nothing, because she had learned across 38 years of 2 in the morning that grief mostly wants a body in the room and not a sermon. She was, in the small geography of a few East Side blocks and 1 Baptist church and 1 hospital basement, a load-bearing wall. Nobody thinks about the wall. You only find out what it was holding up when it comes down. She was supposed to get a retirement party. The unit had planned one, a sheet cake, a card, a folding table in the break room. Then the system tightened its belt that quarter, the way systems do, and the discretionary fund got swept, And somebody in an office Ruth had never seen decided a sheet cake was discretionary. They told her on a Friday. The supervisor apologized and meant it. Ruth said it was fine. She said it the way you say it when it mostly is. And she spent the last hour of 38 years alone in the basement, packing what was hers into 2 cardboard boxes, a coffee mug, the spare cardigan off the hook, a framed certificate, the green box wrapped in a dish towel so it wouldn't rattle. She carried the boxes up one at a time because her shoulder had been bothering her. She drove home to the little brick house on Linden Avenue, set the cardboard down in the hall, walked past it, and slid the green box back under her bed where it had lived for most of her adult life. She did not open it again for a long time. Nobody called to check on her that week. Her children didn't know the exact day she'd retired. She figured they were busy. She figured she'd mention it next time they called. She had 3 of them, and they had each left in their own way, for their own reasons, and none of them had left badly. That was the part that would make it so much harder later. 130 miles east, in a glass tower in Pittsburgh, a man named Theodore Brandt was being told again that his life was a success by every available measure. The measures were everywhere, if you cared to look. The corner office on the 40th floor, with 2 rivers spread out below it like something he owned. The Maybach S-Class idling in the heated garage with a driver named Pavel who'd been with him 11 years. The Patek Philippe on his wrist that he never mentioned, because the people who mattered already knew what it was. The Wharton degree, the second one, the executive one he'd gone back for at 41 to settle a score with a version of himself that no longer existed. Brett Northgate Development had its name on 9 buildings between Pittsburgh and Columbus, and Dio had built every one of them out of a kid from a duplex in Akron, the son of a man who fixed transmissions and a woman who cleaned the same 3 offices for 19 years. He was 58. He gave money away now. That was the new phase, the phase his advisors called legacy. He sat on boards. He sat, in fact, on the board of the Mercy Children's Hospital Foundation in Cleveland, a drive he made 4 times a year for meetings where he approved things and shook hands and left before the coffee cooled. He was good at it, the way he was good at everything, which is to say from a distance, behind glass, in a suit that cost more than Pavel made in a month. He wrote large checks, and he attended the galas, and he let them put his name on a wing. And the whole machinery of his philanthropy ran on the one principle that had organized his entire adult life, which was that you could fix almost anything by paying for it, and never once setting foot in the place where the trouble actually lived. What none of the boards knew, what his own daughter only half knew, was where the giving came from. Theo Brandt did not write checks to a children's hospital because it polished well in a press release, though it did. He wrote them because of 26 years ago, and a stretch of nights he had spent most of his adult life building tall buildings on top of so he would never have to stand on them again. His daughter Mara had been born at 26 weeks, 1 pound, 9 ounces, small enough that his wedding ring slid up over her forearm. Theo had been 32 and broke, actually broke, the first real money still 4 years off, and he had lived for 11 weeks in the waiting room of the neonatal unit at Mercy Children's Inn, Cleveland, because his wife stayed with her sister near the hospital and there was no room for him and no money for a motel, and nowhere else on the earth he was willing to be. He had been a different man then, frightened all the way down, stripped of every story he told about himself, because none of the stories mattered when a machine was breathing for your child and a doctor wouldn't promise you tomorrow. He didn't eat the first 3 days, didn't think to. Then on the 4th night, around 2 in the morning, a heavy-set black woman in a hairnet came up out of the basement to change the coffee, and she looked at him the way you look at a stray, the way you look at somebody whose body has stopped taking care of itself, and she went back down. And she came back up with a tray, meatloaf, a roll, green beans, cornbread, a carton of milk. She set it on the little table by the doors and said one thing before she disappeared back into the elevator. Nobody eats alone on my watch. She did it every night for 11 weeks. She never told him her name, and he was too far gone to ask it. Some nights, she sat down across from him for a minute, not talking, just there, the way you sit with somebody in the worst hour so the hour has a witness. He learned the rhythm of her elevator, the sound of the doors, and he found that around 2 in the morning he would start listening for it, and that the listening was the only thing in those weeks that felt like hope. And on the worst night, the night the doctors used the word they never wanted to use, and he sat shaking in a thin denim jacket with his teeth knocking, certain he was about to lose her, the woman came up, took the coat off her own back, a brown second-hand thing 2 sizes too big, and laid it over his shoulders. She held it there a second with one cracked hand, the way you'd settle a blanket on a child. Then she went back down to her kitchen without a word. Mara lived. She turned the corner that night. The doctors couldn't fully explain it, and 11 days later they took her home in a car seat that swallowed her whole. She was 26 now, finishing her residency in pediatrics 2 states away, alive in the world because a 1-pound girl had decided to stay. And in all of it, the 11 weeks, the meatloaf, the coat, the woman sitting across from him at 2 in the morning so he would not be alone in it. Theo Brandt had never once asked her name. He'd meant to. He had always meant to. Then Mara turned the corner. They took her home and he never went back down to that basement. And the years closed over the whole thing the way water closes over a dropped stone. He told himself he'd forgotten her. He had not forgotten her. You do not forget the person who feeds you on the night you find out whether your child gets to live. You just build something tall enough to stand on so you never have to look down. He was about to have to look down. Because 8 days from the morning, the potatoes rolled down Ruth Calloway's steps. The foundation board would be handed a cost reduction proposal, and line 41 of that proposal would recommend shutting down overnight food service in the basement kitchen. And Theo Brandt, who signed things from a distance, behind glass, was going to read 4 words on a page and feel the floor of 26 years give way beneath him all at once. But that was 8 days off, and none of them, not Theo, not Ruth, not the boy across the street already lacing up a sneaker with a strip of duct tape holding the left sole on, had any idea yet how close together their lives already sat. Ruth fell on a Thursday in December on the back step. On a skin of ice she hadn't seen in the dark. She was 71. She'd gone out to bring in the trash can before the wind took the lid, the way she'd done 10,000 times, and her foot went out from under her, and she came down on her right hip on the concrete edge of the step. She heard it before she felt it, a sound like a dry branch. Then she was on the cold ground looking up at her own back porch light, and her leg would not answer her, and the trash can lid rolled off into the yard and clattered against the fence and went still. She lay there for 40 minutes. It was 26 degrees. She called out twice and then stopped, because there was no one close enough to hear, and shouting was costing her warmth she could not spare. She prayed a little, not for rescue exactly, but the way you talk to somebody you've talked to your whole life, and it was Miss Inez, 2 doors down, a sister from the church, 76 herself, up early, the way the old get up early, who finally saw Ruth's porch light burning at the wrong hour and came across in her housecoat and house shoes slipping on the same ice, and found Ruth on the ground, and got down beside her and would not leave, called for help on a cordless phone, and then held Ruth's good hand and prayed loud enough for both of them until the ambulance came. The hip was broken in 2 places. They put a rod and 3 screws in it. The surgeon said the surgery went well. The discharge planner said something else, that Ruth could not go home to an empty house and climb stairs and live alone on one good leg, not for a while, maybe not ever, and that she needed to think about who could stay with her. Ruth had 3 children. She knew their numbers by heart. She called Loretta first, the oldest, out in Phoenix. Loretta had left Cleveland at 23 and never really come back, and she loved her mother the way you love a place you used to live, warmly and from a great distance. She called every Sunday, 15 minutes. She asked about the weather and about the church and whether her mother was eating right. For 19 years she had been saying, "I'll come out and see you soon." And for 19 years she had meant it. And the 2,000 miles had quietly turned that meaning into something you could put off forever and still feel, on Sunday afternoons, like a good daughter. When Ruth told her about the hip, there was a pause about 3 seconds long, and a television murmuring somewhere behind her. And then Loretta said, "Mama, I want to, you know I want to, but Dave just changed jobs, and the guest room's the baby's room now. Let me look into some options for you, okay? There's good places now, real nice ones." I'm going to look into it. The answer came out smooth, like she'd had it written down for years and was only now reading it aloud. Ruth said, "Okay, baby." She called Dale next, the middle one, down in Charlotte. Dale sent money, $300 in the first of every month, through the app. And the money was the phone call. It was how Dale said the thing he could not sit still long enough to say. He'd grown up watching his parents do arithmetic at the kitchen table, and he had decided, somewhere along the way, that money was the one language that didn't lie, and he had gotten good at speaking it and forgotten there were others. He picked up between meetings. When Ruth told him, his voice put on the right shape of concern, the way a voice does when a person knows the shape but not the weight. Okay, Mama, here's what I'll do. I'll bump it up to $500 a month and I'll find you a home care service. There are agencies for this. We'll get somebody good in there. He did not say he would come. He said he would find somebody. He said it the way you say you'll find a contractor. Thank you, Dale, Ruth said. Flat, not cold, just flat. The way a voice goes when it is run out of the strength to be anything else. She called Pam last. Pam was the one she had hoped she would not have to call. Pam was the youngest, and Pam had stayed in Cleveland 11 years past when her brother and sister left, had driven Ruth to every appointment, cleaned at the house on Saturdays, sat at the kitchen table and laughed in the same 3 places at the same 3 stories. Because her mother deserved someone to be proud with her, Pam had taken her mother to church every Sunday and to the foot doctor every month and to her own children's recitals in between. And somewhere in the 4th year of doing it alone, she had started crying in her car in the driveway before she came in. Not because she'd stopped loving her mother, because she was carrying a thing built for 3 people by herself, and not once in those years had her brother or her sister or anyone else thought to ask if she was tired. When her husband got the offer in Denver, Pam saw a door, and she walked through it, and she'd been gone 18 months, and she had not made her peace with any of it. The phone rang 5 times. Ruth almost hung up. Then Pam answered, and Ruth told her, and the silence on the line stretched so long that Ruth looked at the screen to be sure the call hadn't dropped. She could hear her daughter breathing. The careful kind, the kind you do to keep from making a sound. Then Pam said, "I can't do this again right now." She didn't say Denver. She didn't say her job, her marriage, the 11 years. She didn't say I'm sorry. 5 words, and she stopped, and Ruth, who had known for years exactly why and had never once said it out loud, because saying it would only have made Pam hurt worse, Ruth said the only thing left to say, "All right." The line went quiet. Then it clicked. A nurse came in a little later, young, maybe 26, and saw the phone face down on the blanket, and asked, gentle, "Is there anyone else you want to call, Miss Calloway?" Ruth looked at the window. It faced the parking lot. Nothing out there worth looking at. She looked at it anyway. "No, thank you," she said. That was everybody. She was wrong about that, as it turned out, but it would take her a while to find out how wrong, and the people who would prove her wrong were not the ones she dialed. What broke her, in the end, was not the children. It was the paperwork. Because here is what 38 years had actually bought her. The hospital had carried Ruth on the books as a part-time, per diem food service worker for most of those decades. It was cheaper that way, and per diem workers did not get the pension the full-timers got. It is worth knowing who tends to get carried like that on purpose. Year after year, the cooks and the housekeepers and the aides, and in a city like Cleveland, that means it falls hardest and longest on Black women and on immigrants. The people who do the lifting in the places we'd rather not look at directly. Ruth's retirement came to a little over $600 a month. When the medical bills from the hip hit, her supplemental coverage lapsed in the gap between one plan ending and another beginning, and the copay on her heart medication, the pills that kept the muscle beating in a steady rhythm instead of a stutter, jumped from $4 to $61. So Ruth did what she had always done, arithmetic. She started cutting the pills in half with a paring knife on the kitchen counter, making 30 days of medicine last 60. She took 2 buses and a long cold walk to the county benefits office to ask for help, and she waited an hour and 40 minutes on a plastic chair, and when her number came up, she explained it all through a scratched plexiglass window to a man who did not look unkind, only finished. He typed. He frowned at the screen. He said her income put her $400 over the line for the assistance she'd come for, and that she could file an appeal, and that the appeals were running about 11 months behind. 11 months. Ruth was 71 with a stuttering heart and a pill cut in half on her counter. "Those are the rules, ma'am," the man said, not cruelly. He had said it 900 times. He would say it 900 more. He was not the problem. He was just the last face the problem wore before it reached her. The problem was older and bigger than him, built up over decades by people who would never have to sit on a plastic chair for an hour and 40 minutes, and it had been designed, whether anyone meant it that way or not, to wear a person down until they stopped asking. Ruth did not stop asking because she was weak. She stopped asking because she was proud, and because asking twice for something you have earned and been refused is a particular kind of humiliation that a woman like Ruth Calloway would walk a long way around. She rode the bus home. She did not tell the church. She did not tell her children about the pills. She sat in her cooling kitchen with Clarence's bus pass in her wallet and a half a pill on the counter, and she did the only thing left, which was endure. Because she had been built by a grandmother in Tuscaloosa to endure, and the building had held for 71 years. The next morning, the Weather Service put out a warning. A hard freeze coming down out of Canada by the weekend. The coldest air in a decade. And Ruth Calloway, on a half a heart pill, had no idea that the worst night of that winter was also going to be the one that saved her life. The grocery bag tore on a gray Tuesday morning 2 weeks after she got home. She'd taken a cab to the store, $14 each way. A number that ate the difference between her and the edge. And she was working the bags up her own front steps one at a time on the walker when the wet paper gave out. The bag split. 5 potatoes hit the porch and went bumping down the steps too. The sidewalk and a can of beans and the eggs and a sack of cornmeal that split its seam, and Ruth lowered herself down onto the cold top step because chasing them was not a thing her body could do anymore. And she sat there in the gray light with one hand in her lap and watched her groceries scatter across the concrete. From the greenhouse across the street, a boy was watching. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 15. He lived with his grandmother, Geneva, and his little sister, Tamia, who was 7, in the house with the basketball hoop nobody used. His mother was 3 years gone, not dead, just gone, swallowed by something the family didn't say out loud. And Geneva worked the register at a drugstore on her bad feet and came home smelling of the rubber floor mats. And Marcus had learned a long time ago how to need nothing out loud. He got Tamia up and fed and braided in the mornings because Geneva slept till 10 after the late shift. He gave Tamia the bigger half of everything and told her he wasn't hungry, which was a lie he'd been telling since he was 11 and had gotten very good at. There was a strip of duct tape holding the left sole of his sneaker on. He'd worn through the last pair and he wasn't going to ask Geneva for new ones because he knew what shoes cost and he knew what her feet cost her. So he'd been saving. He had $43 in a sock in his drawer and a plan to get to 60. Marcus was not a remarkable boy by the measures schools use. C+, B-. He didn't play ball. He didn't run with anybody in particular. Teachers didn't write his name on the board for good or for trouble. The counselor couldn't have picked him out of the yearbook. But he had one thing that 15-year-old boys are not famous for having. He noticed people. He picked up litter on the way to school because he saw it, and his hands were free. He held the door for whoever was behind him without turning to see who it was. When the lunch lady forgot his fork, he ate with a spoon and said nothing because he could see she was tired. He noticed the way you notice weather, who was carrying too much. He watched the old woman sit down on her steps. He looked at the potato that had rolled the farthest, stopped against the curb. He looked at her, alone on the concrete with her hand in her lap. Then he set his backpack on his own porch and crossed the street. He picked up the potatoes, the can, the eggs, the cornmeal, the bag of flour that had split a seam. He gathered it all back together as best he could and carried it up the 3 steps and set it inside her door. She turned her head and looked up at him. "Thank you, baby," she said. "Yes, ma'am," said Marcus. Then he went to school, and the next morning he was on his own porch at 6, waiting. And when no cab came, he crossed the street and rang the bell and said, "You need somebody to go to the store." Not a question. She said he didn't have to. He said he knew. That was the whole conversation. She wrote him a list in shaky block letters on the back of an envelope and gave him 2 20s, and he walked the 8 cold blocks to the store and came back with the bags and the change, and he set the bags inside the door, and he gave her the change, and he went to school. He didn't tell his grandmother. He didn't tell anybody. He just started leaving for school 20 minutes earlier, and when a boy at school asked him why he was always early now, he said, "I just like walking in the morning." And that was the whole of it. Then the freeze came. It came in on a Friday night, and by midnight the thermometer on Lonnie's market down the block read 11 degrees. Lonnie, who'd run the corner store 30 years and carried half the block on credit in the slow weeks and never once posted a sign about it, had closed early and gone home to his own furnace. Ruth's furnace gave a single hard click around 2 in the morning and went silent, and the cold came up through the floor of the little brick house like water filling a boat. She got up. She found the thermostat dead. She knew. The way you know a thing in your body. What a furnace repair cost on a holiday weekend. She had already gotten the quote a month back when it had been wheezing. $940. And she knew she did not have it. And she knew she was not going to call the children. And she knew with a flat certainty that frightened her more than the cold did, that her chest had started to do the stuttering thing, the thing the pills were supposed to stop, and that she had exactly 1/2 of 1 pill left in the bottle on the counter. She put on Clarence's old coat. She put a blanket over that. She got her grandmother's green box out from under the bed and set it on the kitchen table next to her, the way you keep what matters close when the boat is taking on water, and she sat down in the kitchen chair to wait for morning. Because the bedroom was too far and the bed was too cold, she did the arithmetic one more time. The drugstore opened at 8. It was 2:15. 5 hours and 45 minutes. Her heart skipped, skipped. She closed her eyes and she said the 23rd Psalm the way she'd learned it as a girl, not because she was sure of being heard, but because the words were a railing and she needed something to hold. Across the street, Marcus could not sleep, and he looked out his window at 2:30 and saw that the one house on the block, with no glow of a furnace vent, no warm breath of exhaust against the cold, was hers. He did not wake his grandmother. He pulled on 2 shirts and the sneaker with the tape, and he ran across the ice in the dark, and he beat on Ruth's door until she came, slow, gray-lipped, confused in a way that scared him more than anything had ever scared him. He got her talking. He found the dead thermostat and the empty pill bottle on the counter and the half a pill in it and the green box on the table. And he understood, 15 years old, all of it at once. The cold, the heart, the money, the pride that had kept her from calling a soul. 11 degrees, 1/2 of 1 pill. 5 hours and 45 minutes until the drugstore. He didn't have a car. He had $43 in a sock. He ran back across the street, dug the sock out of the drawer, the $60 plan, the new shoes, all of it, and ran the 4 cold blocks to the only thing open, the all-night gas station on Lamar. And he bought their last electric space heater for $31 and a phone charger and a packet of hand warmers, and he ran it all back, slipping twice on the ice, going down hard once on his hip the way she had gone down on hers. And he got up and kept going. He plugged the heater in by her chair and cracked the hand warmers and pressed them into her hands, and he sat down on the kitchen floor next to her with his back against the cabinet, and he did not leave. She told him around 4 in the morning not to call anybody, no ambulance. She could not afford an ambulance, and she said so plain, the pride in her standing up even then. And Marcus, who had spent his whole life doing what he was told and needing nothing out loud, broke the rule. He took her phone and he called the nurse line on the back of her old insurance card, and he stayed on the line doing what they told him, watching her color, counting her breaths against the clock, talking to her so she'd keep talking back, asking her about the green box, about the church, about the man in the wallet photo. Anything to keep her here until the gray came up in the windows and her heart settled into something steadier, and the sun finally cleared the rooftops at 6:45. At 8, he was at the drugstore door when they unlocked it. He spent his own last dollars on the part of the copay he could cover and told the pharmacist he'd bring the rest, and the pharmacist, who knew Geneva, waved it off. That was the night the boy across the street stopped being the boy across the street. What came after did not have one big moment in it, and that is exactly why it mattered. He fixed the bottom porch step that fall with a borrowed hammer and a $4 length of pine. After he pried it up and found the wood beneath it rotted soft, he shoveled her walk before he shoveled his own. Geneva watched him from her kitchen window the second snow and decided, the way mothers decide, that whatever her boy was doing across that street did not need interrupting. He brought to me along on Saturday sometimes, and Ruth taught the little girl to crimp the edge of a pie with a fork, and the kitchen on Linden Avenue had children's voices in it again for the first time in 20 years. Ruth taught him to cook. She started with red beans and rice on a Saturday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with her good hand around her tea, calling out the next step every few minutes while he stood at the stove. Use the andouille, not the cheap stuff. Cook your Trinity down slow till it goes soft and sweet. Onion, bell pepper, celery, that's the Trinity. Every kitchen got one. Bay leaf and early. Out before you serve, you don't want nobody choking on a Sunday. He followed every instruction, and the rice came out fine and the beans came out so salty his eyes watered. A tablespoon of salt where she'd said a teaspoon, and Ruth laughed from the chest. The first real laugh since the hip. A laugh that had been waiting somewhere in her a long time. Baby, she said, you tried to season the whole block. He started laughing too. They threw the beans out and ate the rice. He got it right the next Saturday. He learned cornbread after that, and smothered chicken and her grandmother's greens with the smoked turkey neck. And by spring he could put a Sunday plate together that would not embarrass anybody. Saturdays became the shape of the week. Tea he didn't much like, but never said so. Her stories about the cafeteria, about the children whose names she still remembered, about the Guatemalan mother with the rosary and the Somali father, and the white farmer from Holmes County, about the principal who tried once to make her stop feeding the parents, and how the union steward and 3 church mothers had paid him a visit, and how he'd stopped trying. His stories about a girl named Diane he'd said maybe 9 words to in 2 years, about the algebra teacher who pronounced his name wrong for a whole semester, about Tamia and how smart she was and how he was going to make sure she got everything. He never told Ruth about the duct tape on his shoe, or the $43 he'd spent on the heater, or the new shoes he still didn't have. She noticed all of it anyway. She noticed everything. That was her whole life's one skill. There was a week that February when Geneva's hours got cut at the drugstore and the cupboards in the greenhouse went thin, and Marcus, 16 and proud, the way Ruth was proud, said nothing about it to a living soul. But Ruth noticed Tamia eating like a child who wasn't sure when the next plate was coming, and she noticed Marcus sliding the girl the bigger half and calling himself full. And the next Saturday, she made far too much of everything. A pot of greens, a pan of cornbread, a whole chicken smothered down in gravy, and she pressed the leftovers on them at the door and blamed her arthritis. Said her hands couldn't manage a small pot anymore. Said it would only spoil in her icebox. Said, baby, you'd be doing me a favor, taking it off my hands. She did that every Saturday after, clear through the winter, and not once did she say the word help, because she had learned a long time ago that the surest way to feed a proud person is to let them believe that they are the ones feeding you. She took him to church one Sunday in the spring, and greater new hope folded him in the way that church folds people in, the mothers feeding him at the repast until he had to beg off. An old deacon shaking his hand and holding it a beat too long and saying, "You keep watching out for Mother Calloway, you hear?" And Marcus saying, "Yes, sir," and meaning it. Miss Inez, who had found Ruth on the ice, started sending plates home for Geneva and Tamia. Lonnie at the corner store started slipping an extra something in Marcus's bag and waving off the difference. The water Ruth had grown up in, the block that fed its own, the casserole that showed up without a knock, closed quietly back around her. Because she had spent a lifetime being the one who showed up, and the ledger of a life like that, it turns out, is longer than anybody keeps track of. 130 miles east, behind glass, the thing Ruth didn't know about was tightening. Because the cost reduction proposal landed on the foundation board's table that winter, and Theo Brandt, who signed things from a distance, redlined 41, eliminate overnight food service basement kitchen, and underneath it in the supporting notes, a single sentence from an old supervisor objecting to the cut. That the overnight cook had for decades quietly fed the ICU parents out of her own pocket, and that something would be lost that did not show up on a spreadsheet. Theo read that sentence 3 times. Then he asked the hospital for a name, and the hospital's records, bills to forget per diem workers, had almost nothing: a payroll line, a retirement date, a basement and a hairnet, and a rule. He sat in his glass office 130 miles away, with his heart doing something it had not done in 26 years. And he made phone call after phone call, and the system that had been designed to make Ruth Calloway invisible worked exactly as designed. It could not tell him who she was. It was the chaplain who finally said her name out loud. Reverend Emmanuel Adiemi had come to Cleveland from Lagos in 1984 to study at the seminary, and he had meant to go home, and he had not gone home, because he found that the people who most needed somebody to sit with them at 2 in the morning were right here on the night shift, in the part of the hospital the daylight forgot. He had worked those overnight hours 40 years, and for nearly all of them, Ruth Calloway in her basement kitchen had been the only other soul down there who understood what the night shift actually was. They had buried each other's spouses. They had sat with the same grieving parents, the chaplain with his scripture and the cook with her tray, and more than once they had agreed without saying so that the tray reached people, the scripture couldn't, and the scripture reached people, the tray couldn't. And that between the two of them, on a good night, almost nobody on that floor ate alone or grieved alone. When the foundation's call came down to the chaplain's office, asking after an overnight cook nobody could name, Reverend Adeyemi walked into a glass conference room he had never been invited into, and he said it plain. "Her name is Ruth," he said. "Ruth May Calloway. We worked nights together 40 years. She is the one who used to say, 'Nobody eats alone on her watch.'" And he watched a billionaire go white. If you have ever wondered whether the quiet things you do for people just disappear into the air, the meals nobody logged, the rides nobody thanked you for, the showing up that no one wrote down, then stay with me. Because they don't disappear. They wait. Sometimes for 26 years, but they wait. It was a Saturday in late May when Ruth asked Marcus to come back to the bedroom with her for a minute. He was 16 now. He'd had a birthday in March, and Ruth had baked the cake herself standing on her good leg at the counter, and the whole of his celebration had been that cake, and Tamia singing off-key and Geneva crying a little. And it had been, Marcus thought, the best birthday he could remember. The kettle was already on. He followed Ruth down the hall, slow because she was slow, and he watched her lower herself to her knees beside the bed the way she did everything now. One hand flat on the mattress for balance, and slide the rusted green box out from under it. He'd seen it before. He'd seen it on the worst night on the kitchen table. He'd never seen it open. She put a small key in the side. She turned it. She lifted the lid against the dead hinge and the rubber band, and she sat back on her heels and said, "Go on." It was full of paper, hundreds of folded squares, cards, notebook pages with the spiral edges torn, bundled with rubber bands gone brittle. Some of them so old the ink had gone the color of weak tea. Marcus lifted the top bundle out. He opened one at random. A woman's handwriting, soft with age. "You fed me the night my daughter coded. I was alone and you sat with me and I never knew your name. 22 years and I have never forgotten." He opened another. A man's, in block letters. "You were the only person in that whole building who looked at me like I was a person and not a problem. Another in careful second-language English. My son lived. I named my restaurant for a kindness. One day, I hope to tell you. He opened one more, and it was just 3 words, no name, and the 3 words were, "Thank you, Mother." He read 4 of them. Then he set them down on the bed and didn't pick up any more because his hands had started to shake. "That's what I did for 38 years, Ruth said. They gave me $600 a month for 38 years, and that's what the world thought it was worth. She put her cracked hand flat on the pile of paper. This is what it was worth. I never showed a living soul. I wasn't keeping them to prove anything. I just couldn't make myself throw away a person who took the time to write. Here is a number this country would rather not look at. Fewer than half of part-time workers in America are even offered a retirement plan, and the people who cook and clean and lift in our hospitals are very often carried on the books exactly that way, part-time on purpose. And the gap falls hardest on Black workers and immigrant workers, the ones doing the work nobody films. Almost a third of Americans past the age of 59 have nothing at all saved to fall back on. Ruth Calloway was one of them, and she had still, somehow, been saving, just not for herself. "There's one more thing in there," she said. Underneath. Marcus reached back into the box. Under the letters, under all those years of strangers' gratitude, was a plain envelope from KeyBank. His hands were not steady now at all. He opened it. It was a statement for a college savings account. The name on the account was Marcus Webb. It had been opened 2 years earlier, the same month, almost to the day, that a boy had crossed a street for 5 potatoes. There had been small deposits, month after month, never large, never missed. The balance was $38,712, $600 a month. Pills cut in half with a paring knife. $14 cab rides she'd stopped taking the very day a boy started going to the store for her, so she could put the $14 somewhere else. He understood, all at once, where every spare dollar of a poor woman's life had quietly gone, and why a woman with a stuttering heart had sat in a freezing house rather than spend $940 she had already promised, in her own mind, to someone else. He read the number twice. He put the paper down. "Ms. Ruth," he said, "I can't take this." "You already did," she said. He looked at her. "The morning you crossed the street," she said. "You just didn't know yet what you were picking up." He sat down on the edge of the bed because his legs would not hold him. He did not cry the way people cry in movies. He cried the way a boy cries when no one has ever really seen him, and now someone has. And she has put a number on it, and the number is the rest of his life. Tommy's future and his own, and the shoes he'd never asked for, and the college he'd told everyone he wasn't counting on. His shoulders went once. Then he pressed his hands over his face and got quiet. Ruth crossed the room slow and put her good hand on the back of his head, the way she'd settled a coat on a shaking stranger 26 years before, and she said nothing because nothing needed saying. The letters lay on the bed between them, hundreds of strangers across 38 years who had written to tell her she had mattered and she had chosen in the end to hand them to the one child in the world who had simply shown up. And neither of them heard the car that had just pulled up and stopped at the curb outside, a long black car idling, with a man in the back seat who had spent 26 years and more than $1 billion building something tall enough that he would never have to walk up to a door like this one. He was walking up to it now. The knock came while Marcus was still wiping his face. Ruth made her slow way down the hall, and through the screen she saw a man she did not know. Tall, gray at the temples, a coat that probably cost more than her house, and under it the careful stillness of someone who has rehearsed a thing all the way here and is now afraid to say it. Behind him at the curb sat a long black car with a driver, standing beside it, hands folded, looking at the ground. "Mrs. Calloway," the man said, "my name is Theodore Brandt. I don't think you'll remember me." She didn't. 26 years ago, my daughter was born too early at Mercy Children's, 1 pound and 9 ounces. I lived in that waiting room for 11 weeks. His voice was steady until it wasn't. I didn't eat for 3 days, and on the 4th night a woman came up out of the basement kitchen and put a tray down in front of me. Meatloaf, a roll, green beans, cornbread. And she said something to me, and she said it every night for 11 weeks, and on the coldest night she took the coat off her own back and put it over my shoulders. Ruth stood very still behind the screen. She said nobody eats alone on my watch. The kitchen behind her ticked. The kettle was going cold. My daughter is 26, Theo said. She's a pediatrician now. She takes care of other people's babies in the very kind of unit she was born in. And she is alive to do it because somebody decided a 1-pound girl was worth staying for. And I have spent 26 years and a great deal of money making sure I never had to think about the 11 weeks before that, because the 11 weeks were the worst of my life, and you were the only mercy in them. And I never once asked your name. I let them hand me my daughter, and I walked out of that hospital, and I never went back down to that basement. Mrs. Calloway, I am so ashamed of that I can hardly stand on your porch. Ruth opened the screen door. She looked at him a long moment, this stranger weeping in a coat worth more than her life savings. And she searched, honestly, for the young father in him, and she could not find him. There had been so many, 26 years of 2 in the morning faces, white and black and brown, churchgoers and atheists, and a man who prayed on a towel in the corner, and she had never kept score of a single one of them. Because keeping score had never been the point. To keep score, you'd have to be doing it for the credit, and she had never once been doing it for the credit. I fed a lot of people, son, she said gently. I'm sorry, I don't remember you, and that was the thing that finished him. Not that she remembered, that she didn't, that to him it had been the hinge his entire life turned on, the night he measured every other night against, and to her it had been a Tuesday, one Tuesday in 11,000. The full weight of what she had been came down on him in her doorway, that there had been so many nights, so many strangers, so many trays, that the most important act of mercy in Theodore Brandt's life did not even rise to the level of a memory in the woman who had performed it. She had simply been who she was, every single night, for 38 years, for free, in the dark, where no one could see. He came inside. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where a boy had learned to make red beans and rice, and he took out a checkbook, and his hand was shaking. I want to fix this, he said. All of it. Your medical bills, your house, whatever the pills cost. A number. Give me a number, any number, and I'll write it right now. And it won't even be a real number to me. That's the obscene part. I can make all of this disappear before the tea's cold. Ruth looked at the checkbook. Then she folded her cracked hands on the table and she said, No, I don't want your money. Mrs. Calloway, I had what I needed, she said. I had 38 years of work that meant something. I had a husband I loved who set the brake on a bus while his heart was stopping so nobody else would get hurt. I had a church that calls me mother. I had 3 children who turned out the way children turn out. And I'm not going to sit here and let you make my babies into villains, because they're not villains. They're just people. The world ran too thin. And I had that boy right there. She nodded at Marcus in the doorway. I don't need a check to feel all right about my life, son. I already feel all right about my life. That's the thing your money was never going to be able to buy you, and I think you know it, and I think that's why you're really sitting at my table. Theo set the pen down. For a moment he could not speak. But I'll tell you what you can do, Ruth said, and now her voice was not soft. Now it was the voice that had run a basement kitchen for 38 years and stared down a principal and sung alto over a grieving mother in the dark. There's a line in your budget. Marcus's friend the Reverend told me. Number 41, you're fixing to close down that kitchen. Stop feeding the parents at night. She leaned forward across the table. You sat in that chair once, son. You know what 2 in the morning feels like on that floor? When the machine is breathing for your child, and you haven't eaten, and there is not one human being in that whole building who sees you. So don't you dare write me a check. You keep that kitchen open. You make it so no mother and no father ever sits up on that floor shaking and hungry and invisible. Ever again, long after I'm gone, and long after you are too. You make it so it doesn't depend on one old woman deciding to be kind on her own dime. You build it into the walls. That is the only thing I want from you. And it's worth a great deal more than whatever's in that book." For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the cold kettle and the boy breathing in the doorway. "That's a much bigger number," Theo said quietly. "Then it's a good thing," said Ruth, "that you can afford it." He could afford it. The Line 41 cut died in committee within the week, with Theo Brandt himself moving to strike it and daring anyone at the table to argue. In its place, the board approved something new: the Calloway Tray Fund endowed by the Brandt family. A permanent line of money whose entire job was to make sure that any parent keeping vigil over a sick child at Mercy Children's would never again have to choose between the parking garage and dinner. Theo wrote the first check himself. It had a 4 and 6 zeros after it, and he told the board it was the cheapest thing he had ever bought, and he meant it. And then, because shame is only worth anything if it moves your hands, he turned it on the rest. He had his lawyers pull the employment records going back 30 years, and the records told an ugly and familiar story that the hospital had carried hundreds of its lowest paid workers as part-time and per diem for decades, on purpose, to keep them off the pension, and that those workers were overwhelmingly black women and immigrants, the cooks, the housekeepers, the aides, the ones who came up the service elevator at 6 in the morning. He made the board fix it. Not just for Ruth, though. Ruth's retiree health coverage was restored within a month, and a $61 pills went back to costing $4, and a 71-year-old woman stopped cutting her heart medication in half with a paring knife on her counter. But for all of them, the ones still working, and the ones already retired into that same quiet gap. No one got fired over it. The clerk behind the plexiglass kept his job. He had only ever been the last face on a problem he didn't build. They didn't punish a person. They changed the rules that had built the person into a wall between Ruth and what she'd earned. There is a number behind a daughter like Pam, too, and it deserves saying out loud because we are very quick to judge the children who leave. More than 4 in 10 family caregivers in this country are the only the single set of hands for a parent who needs 3 sets, and around 1 in 5 say that what they feel most in the middle of all that love is alone. They are not bad children. They are one person carrying a job built for a family until the day their shoulders simply give out and the rest of the family looks up, surprised, and asks what on earth happened. Pam had carried her mother for 11 years before her shoulders gave out. In all 11, nobody had ever once asked if she was tired. Pam found out about all of it from a cousin's phone call, about the boy, about the billionaire, about the fund with her mother's name on it. She sat in her kitchen in Denver for a long time. Then, she got in her car and drove 900 miles straight through and showed up on Linden Avenue without telling anyone she was coming. And she stood in her mother's kitchen and cried the way you cry when you have been holding it for years, and Ruth held her, one good arm around her grown daughter, and the two of them said some of the things you can only say after the worst of the silence is over. It did not fix everything. Some things 11 years deep do not fully close, and Ruth did not pretend they had, because Ruth had never in her life pretended a thing was healed that wasn't. But Pam came. Of the 3, in the end, Pam was the one who came, and she started coming every few months after that, the 900 miles each way. And she would sit at the kitchen table on a Saturday and laugh in the same 3 places at the same 3 stories, and that was its own kind of mending. The slow kind, the only kind that holds. Loretta sent flowers and a long voicemail. Dale offered to double the fund, and was gently told the fund did not need his money. It needed, if he ever found the time, his face. Whether he ever found it, the story does not say because that part was still being written, the way those things always are. They held a small ceremony in the spring downstairs in the basement. Theo asked for it to be there, not in the lobby with the donors, not at the St. Regis where the foundation held its galas, but down in the kitchen with the humming lights, at the little metal table by the service elevator where, 26 years before, a terrified young man had been handed a tray by a woman he never thanked. Reverend Adeyemi said a few words, and they were the right ones. Because 40 years of 2 in the morning will teach a man which words are the right ones. Geneva came, and Tamia in her good dress, and Miss Inez and Lonnie closed the store for the afternoon, and a busload from Greater New Hope filled the back of that basement and sang, "Because a Baptist church will turn a hospital basement into a sanctuary in about 4 bars and not ask anybody's permission." Ruth came in on Marcus's arm, walking better now, the hip mostly healed. And when she reached that little table by the elevator, Theo Brandt, who owned 9 buildings and had not knelt to anyone in 40 years, got down on his knees on the cold basement floor in front of a woman in a hairnet. She had worn the hairnet on purpose. She'd told Marcus that morning, because that was who she'd been when it mattered, and she wasn't going to dress up to be thanked for it, and he thanked her out loud with her name, the way he should have a quarter of a century before. She told him to get up off that cold floor before he hurt his knees, an old man like him, and the basement laughed, and that broke the thing in the room that needed breaking, and then everybody was laughing and crying at the same time, which is the only honest way to do either one. On the wall by the elevator they hung a small plaque with her name on it, and under the plaque, on a shelf behind a pane of glass, they set the dented green metal recipe box, rusted at the corners. The lid still held with a rubber band, emptied of its letters now, because Ruth had given those to Marcus, but kept there anyway, in the one place in that whole gleaming hospital where it truly belonged. A boy in a college sweatshirt had asked that it be put there. He still visits it sometimes, because Marcus went to college. The $38,712 saw to the start of it, and the rest he earned working summers and holding a job through the term and looking after Tamia's future the way Ruth had looked after his. He studied to be a nurse, and then more than a nurse, because he had decided somewhere along the way that he wanted to work the floor where parents sit up at 2 in the morning. And he wanted to be one of the people who sees them. He came home on the breaks and drank tea. He still didn't much like at a kitchen table on Linden Avenue. And Tamia grew up calling Ruth her grandmother. And nobody corrected her, because by then it was simply true. And on the night the Calloway Tray Fund served its very first meal, it was Marcus who carried it up. He rode the service elevator to the ICU floor with a tray in his hands, meatloaf, a roll, green beans, cornbread, a carton of milk, and he found a man sitting alone outside a glass room at 2 in the morning, gray-faced, not eating, not anything. The way a person looks when the worst is happening on the other side of the glass and there is nothing to do but wait. He set the tray down on the little table beside him. The man looked up. "I can't pay for this," he said. "You don't have to," said Marcus. "Nobody eats alone on her watch." The man stared at him, not understanding, and Marcus didn't explain, because some things you don't explain, you just pass on. He sat down across from the man for a minute, not talking, just there, so the hour would have a witness. Then he got up and went back to his rounds, and behind him the man ate, slowly at first. Then, like he'd remembered he was hungry, and somewhere 2 floors down a green box sat behind glass with a dead woman's grandmother's recipes in it, and a sentence that had outlived everyone who first said it. "Kindness doesn't keep a schedule. It doesn't pay you back on the day you need it, or in the form you'd have asked for. But it keeps a record, and the record outlives the people who think no one is counting." Ruth Calloway fed strangers for 38 years, and when she finally needed help, her own 3 children couldn't make room for her, so she handed her whole life savings to the boy across the street, and she left her 3 children nothing. 2 of them had been gone for years and barely looked back. But the third one, Pam, had given 11 years of her life to her mother before she finally broke and ran. And in the end she got the same nothing as the brother who only sent money and the sister who only sent excuses. So here is what I cannot stop turning over, and I think it is going to split this room right down the middle. Was Ruth right to leave Pam out with the other 2? Or did the one who stayed the longest earn something different, even though, in the end, she couldn't stay forever? Is it fair to give nothing to the daughter who gave the most? Or is fair a word that only belongs to the people who showed up at all? I don't have the answer. I've argued myself onto both sides of it, and I still don't. Tell me yours down in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story put a face in your mind, somebody who has shown up for you without ever once being asked, Somebody who feeds the whole room and never asks to be fed? Then don't just sit there with it. Call them. Not a text, a call. There is a difference, and the person on the other end of the line has known what that difference is the whole time. Subscribe if you believe the quiet ones, the load-bearing walls, the women in the hairnets deserve to be remembered out loud. And share this with the one person who showed up for you when no one else did. These stories are works of fiction. Ruth and Marcus and Theo live only here in this telling. But somewhere near you tonight, somebody is carrying bags up a set of steps for a person who has no one, asking for nothing, keeping no score. I wrote this one because a long time ago I crossed a street like that, just once. And I have never stopped being glad I did. Go be somebody's Tuesday. I'll see you in the next one.